alongside the scientific revolution is the Age of Enlightenment, which is really why Europe during this time period between your 16th to um, 18th, sometimes kind of even pushing into 19th centuries, is this movement or known as the Age of Reason. So the Enlightenment is just the intellectual movement that is focused on logic and reason and applying it to human society. So really kind of these philosophical standpoints about how we're understanding our government, how we're understanding individuals in society, and kind of the role of the individuals. So ultimately, the Enlightenment is an extension of the scientific revolution. As you have men like Copernicus or Galileo that are kind of bringing forth these ideas of challenging the assumptions that we had about science and about astronomy, we're going to see that we then start applying this to our understanding of society. So what you have is philosophes, which are, it's just the French word for a philosopher. These are men and women, but women are still kind of frowned upon as far as engaging in the Enlightenment. And their focus on reason and this idea of individual progress in society, the ideas of liberty, the ideas that an individual should be able to achieve happiness in this life rather than having to wait until the afterlife with this expectation that they may not even be able to achieve it then. They engage in discourse or conversation at salons where both men and women are actually coming together to kind of have these philosophical discussions. And all of this develops in the midst of kind of some turmoil in Europe. Not only just the turmoil between states fighting with each other, but we're going to get into, when the Age of Revolutions occurs, this conflict that erupted in England between the Parliament and the King. So there's various thinkers that are involved or associated with the Enlightenment. You have Thomas Hobbes, who is probably the one that I would say is a little bit more different than the other two, or the other few. And that he is a proponent of absolute monarchs. He had kind of observed this conflict with Parliament and the King and kind of recognized or comes up with this idea that humans are just naturally selfish. They naturally are kind of prone to evil or wickedness. And that because of that and this inclination to act in a selfish manner, individuals in society need a strong ruler to provide law and to provide order. And that if you kind of loosen those reins, then that chaos will erupt, as he had kind of witnessed and observed firsthand in England. And so he argues that the absolute monarch is the best form of government. But it kind of is a separation from the other thinkers. John Locke is probably the figure that you will hear about the most over the course of your educational career, because he had such a vast impact on the American Revolution and kind of American thoughts. And so he was an English philosopher, and he is going to believe instead, not necessarily that people have that they're naturally prone to be selfish or wicked, but really that we're born with this blank slate, tabula rasa, where we are going to be impacted by our experiences and kind of are able to develop that way. So that we're not inherent, like no characteristic is necessarily inherent in an individual, but rather developed over time. He also is a proponent of the idea of natural rights. And so this is where he comes up with this life, liberty, and property. Every individual is considered equal and entitled to these natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And so that's where you should be familiar or know Thomas Jefferson's kind of use of natural rights or violation of the honor code with the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. John Locke believes that government is only able to form through the consent of the governed, that people are the ones that give government their position and therefore enter into a social contract with the government. Again, that the people are going to kind of sign, in a sense, this contract by allowing a government to rule. The government is meant to protect the individual's natural rights. If the government is not doing so, then obviously the people can kind of remove that government from a position of power. Again, their consent is what allows the government to exist. So a lot of these ideas are what you're going to see in the American Revolution, and kind of the extension of the other revolutions as well. Voltaire is a French philosopher. Voltaire is more so a critic, where he is going to write various satires about the clergy and about the government. And he is called to the carpet quite a bit about this, and really kind of has to, or faces some difficulty and some backlash from what he has said. So he believes that people have the right to have freedom of expression, to express their opinions. Freedom of religion. So France is, if you remember, very Catholic and had targeted the French Protestants, the Huguenots in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacres. There's this history of lacking religious toleration in France. So he believes that they should be more tolerant. He focuses on freedom of speech, etc. And so he says, I may not agree with you, but I will die defending your right to state your opinion. So Voltaire is pretty significant in that idea of like what individual freedoms should be in society. Montesquieu is French as well. He is going to argue that England had the best government form. And again, this is a little bit later, but he argues that you should have various branches in the government. So the executive in England, which would be your monarch, your legislative, which was your parliament, and then they also had the judicial, which was their court systems. Because he believes that, yeah, people, power can, in a sense, potentially corrupt. And so we need to have checks on that power. And so by having different branches, and the branches having specific authority to do certain actions, they will kind of check each other and keep each other from doing too much. Rousseau is similar to Locke in the idea of the consent of the governed, but a little bit more extreme potentially in how he believes the people should be involved in the government. So he is from Geneva, and he argues that man becomes corrupted over time, and that the true form of government should be a direct democracy, that true consent of the governed comes from the governed governing themselves, that the individuals ought to create the government and be hands-on in that government. Obviously, having a true direct democracy is very hard. Even Athens didn't really have a true direct democracy. Whew, that was a mouthful there. So really kind of struggled with that. He also believed that, everybody should be equal, and in doing so kind of abolished the titles of nobility. And so he is a proponent of the social contract theory again, but the people are choosing their government, and that means directly involved in that government process. Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the females that's going to be involved in the Enlightenment. So again, most of the Enlightenment thinkers excluded women. Women did engage in the salon, so again, where they would kind of meet and have these discussions, but their role is very, very limited. So Wollstonecraft is going to argue that women deserve the right to education. They should have education to enhance their virtue, to be considered useful to society. And so she's a little bit different, and still is forced to, or is challenged by the patriarchal society. So she writes a vindication of the rights of woman, but again, doesn't necessarily receive as much recognition as she probably should. There's other ideas of the Enlightenment. So this idea that slavery should end, this focus on equality, this is not a hugely popular idea at the time. They do focus on more democratic ideas, secular thinking, so pulling away from the church dominating things. That was already something that was kind of coming into the midst. But you're going to see that not all Enlightenment thinkers are strictly Christian. Some of them are deist. They do focus on practicing tolerance and some of the ideas of having a right to a speedy trial, making sure that your punishment fits the crime that you're doing rather than having this very, very harsh punishment for a minor crime, and abolishing torture as a means of getting information or as kind of a response to a crime. And the last little thing is that there are enlightened despots, and that just basically means that there were enlightened absolute leaders that had basically absolute monarchs. Despotic means, has complete control over everything. that were influenced by the Enlightenment. And you have Frederick II, who is from Prussia, that really kind of focused on improving education and reducing censorship. And so he has these ideas of enlightenment and with this freedom of expression and allowing more people to receive an education. But he is still an absolute monarch, so he's still going to have kind of complete control there. He really wants to strengthen the country, and he believes that in order to do so, you need to, kind of utilize some of those Enlightenment ideas. Catherine the Great, or Catherine II, is one of the other pivotal figures here. But Catherine undergoes this change. So she actually was not Russian. She married into the Romanov dynasty, and she is going to struggle with that a little bit. So her husband, is kind of depicted as somebody that she doesn't love because of his own actions. He was not necessarily a great person. And so he dies, and Catherine is then able to ascend to the throne. She had previously been very interested in the Enlightenment, had actually invited Voltaire to come to Russia to visit on several occasions. But when she rules, there is this uprising, and there is a peasant, kind of like a serf, who rebels, but he claims that he was her dead husband. And for whatever reason, there are people that believe him. And, this is more so this era of nobility misusing serfs or mistreating them. And Catherine is forced to kind of rein this rebellion in, because it gets to be out of control. And so she has to rely on the nobility. Well, the nobility under Enlightenment had kind of been losing some of that position. So as she has to rely on them to help her squash this rebellion and deal with this man who is leading the rebellion, she has to kind of backtrack on focusing on the Enlightenment. So towards the end of her reign, you kind of see that she's no longer an enlightened despot, but rather someone that is maintaining this presence in government of true absolute monarchy. All right, so that is the end of the Enlightenment.